So again, thank you guys for participating sa aming icebreaker. I hope na hindi namin kayo masyadong pinahirapan. But nevertheless, congratulations to those who've successfully answered sa ating word search. So expect na imi-message namin kayo mamaya after class to claim your prizes. So for proper discussion, hi ma'am and classmates, good morning. We are the Group 5 and we are the last reporters for this semester. So for today, we will report about the part of the manuscript which is part of doing a experimental research. Okay, part of the manuscript, it comprises 5 chapters. Chapter 1 is for the introduction of the study. Chapter 2 is about the review of related literature. Chapter 3 is all about the methodology. Chapter 4 is what results and discussions of the study can be found. And for the last chapter, the summary, conclusion, and recommendations of the study. And lastly, the references. This report will be an aid because in research proposal, we will be writing up to the chapter 3 or up to the methodology section. So let's start. So for the topic for discussion, our objective for today is to know what is experimental research, types of experimental research, parts of the manuscript, and how to write different parts of the manuscript. So to start,
Hi guys, I am Catherine Joy Banta from ESP 3-10. So, for today, we will tackle about what is the experimental research. Just a brief explanation. So, experimental research is research conducted with a scientific approach using two sets of variables. The first set acts as a constant which we use to measure the differences of second set. And for example, quantitative research methods is the example of experimental research. So in experimental research design, if you don't have enough data to support your decisions, you must first determine the facts. So it gathers the data necessary to help you make better decisions. In any research conducted under scientifically acceptable conditions uses experimental methods. This success of experimental studies hinges on researchers confirming the change of variable is based solely on the manipulation of the constant variable. The research should establish a noticeable cause and effect. There are different types of experimental research. So we have pre-experimental research design, through experimental research design, and quasi-experimental research design. So for pre-experimental research design, a group or various group are kept under observation under implementing factors of cause and effect. You conduct this research to understand whether further investigation is necessary for these particular groups, and you can break down pre-experimental research in different types, or it has three types. First is one-shot case study research design. Second is one group pre-test post-test research design. And lastly is static group comparison. So for number two is through experimental research design. Through experimental research design relies on statistical analysis to prove or disprove a hypothesis, making it a most accurate form of research. Of the types of experimental design, only through design can establish a cause and effect relationship within a group. So, through experimental research design, three factors need to be satisfied. First is there is a control group. Then, second is a variable which can be manipulated by the researchers. And lastly is random distribution. This experimental design also methods commonly occurs in physical sciences. So last is quasi-experimental research design. From the word quasi indicates similarities. So a quasi-experimental research design is similar to experimental, but it is not the same. The difference between the two assignment of control group. In this research, an independent variable is manipulated, but the participants of a group are not randomly assigned. So in quasi-research design is used in field settings, which is where a random assignment is either irrelevant or not required. So next, we will tackle more of this research designs when or deeply when our reports goes by. Next is the parts of the manuscript. First is introduction. Then we have RRL or related review related literature. Next is methodology. Fourth is results and discussion. Fifth is summary, conclusion, and recommendation. And lastly is the reference. So in introduction, we have the statement of the problem. We will tackle also the objectives of the study. And the third one is significance of the study. Next is the scope and the limitations. Letter E is definition of terms. Letter F is theoretical framework. And last is conceptual framework. So for the introduction, it is a brief explanation to his or her objectives in their paper by listing the key points. The explanations must be a brief or interesting enough to arise in a reader of the paper or design a read further. An introduction should include a thesis statement. It comes to form of a declaration of writer's opinion which form the basis of the research paper. So, in introduction, a writer gives his or her brief explanation so that the readers would understand the plot or the summary of the research paper. Next is under the introduction is the statement of the problem. So the statement of the problem in research is the description of an existing issue that needs to be addressed. It is actually the pillar of the introduction chapter through which the reader can understand the research questions and scope of the project. Your study will be conducted, or if you do not define the problem statement properly, then the results will be unmanageable. So it is the part where the study show the questions or factors that will be tackled all throughout the study. It is also the part that contains the question that you will be answering throughout your study. So that the statement of the problem are the pillars of the foundation of this introduction. So for example, is what is the level of aggression of participants? It tackles what the issue of the study and the factors or the things that will be saying inside the research study. So the second example is there a significant relationship between the hours of sleep and the level of aggression of the participants? So it tackles the what's happening inside your paper. Yan. So for the next part of the manuscript or part of the objectives is part of the introduction is the objectives of the study. So research objectives describes concisely what the research is trying to achieve. They summarize the accomplishments a researcher wishes to achieve throughout the project and provide direction to the study. Your research objectives must be clear and understandable so that you know where your study is going. It should be also complete with details and specific or straight to the point so that the readers will know right away what are the purpose of conducting the research that you are making. But before forming a research objectives, you should read about all the developments in your area of research and find gaps in knowledge that needs to be addressed. So in writing the objectives, it must tackle the intention of your study and also what do you want to achieve throughout your study. So, for example, first is to determine the level of aggression of the participants, and second is to determine the significant relationship between the hours of sleep and the level of aggression of the participants. So, as you can notice, both statement of the problem and objectives have similar or they are common in some ways. So, for the differences, the statement of the problem are the questions that need to be answered, and on the objectives of the study is the questions that is answered. throughout this research paper. So, letter C is the significance of the study. The significance of the study is basically the importance of your research. It must be stated in the introduction section of your research paper. While stating the significance, you must highlight how your research will be beneficial to the development of science and the society in general. You can first outline the significance in a broader sense by stating how your research will contribute to the broader problem in your field and gradually narrow it down to demonstrate the specific group that will benefit to the research. So, in writing the significance of, in writing the significance of the study, it must answer the question of why should your research to be published. Second is how your study contribute to the development of your field. And lastly is who are the beneficiaries of your study. So, for example, is to the field of psychology, this study will serve as our contribution to the field of psychology. The data, analysis, and conclusions that this research will give would reserve as reference to the future researchers with either the same or related studies like ours. So, for this example, it answers the questions of why should your research be published? So for this significance, it will be significant to the field of psychology because the this research that conducted is would be beneficial to the field of psychology and it should be published because it will contribute a data analysis and conclusion that this research will be given. So it will be served as the reference to the future students or future researchers that will be conducting their study. So that's all. Thank you.
Hi, this is Janela Cassandra Vargas, and I'm here to discuss the continuation about the other four parts of the chapter 1 of doing an experimental research. Next slide. Now let us move on about the scope and delimitation. So the main purpose or the aim of stating the S&D of a study was to define the topic and the boundaries of the research problem to be investigated. Next. To define the scope of the study, this is how in-depth your study is to explore the research question and the parameters in which it will operate in relation to the population and time frame. So basically, the scope states the coverage of your study. Next. So for the other side of the coin, which is the delimitation of the study, here is the definition. These are the factors and variables not to be included in the investigation. These are the boundaries that the researcher or the researcher sets for the research or study. Next slide. Next one is the limitation of the study. Limitations are the characteristic of the research that are out of the researcher's control but still can influence the research findings because they still have an effect to the validity and reliability of the study. I also added this one because you can also include the limitation of your study on your paper under the scope and the limitation. And also, there's still misconception and misunderstanding about the delimitation and limitation of the study kasi. So, to lessen the confusion about these two, I just want to briefly discuss what is their difference. So, pardon me because this is the only way I know how to discuss it clearly to you guys. When we talk about the delimitation, these are the things or the elements that the researcher or the researchers will not do because they already had set a boundaries based on their scope. While the limitation, these are the elements naman that you as the researcher of your own study cannot do because these are the things that outside of your control. So or the weakness of your study and could affect and influence your research. I hope na paintindi ko po yun sa inyo kahit papano. So, kapag scope, coverage siya ng study. Kapag the limitations, boundaries na naiset based on your scope. And yung limitation naman is yung potential weaknesses ng study. Next slide. So the question here is how can you effectively write your scope and delimitation? You can refer on what was written on the slide as your guidelines on writing a correct and a proper scope and delimitation for your research study. The scope and delimitation must answer the following. First, it must answer the question what. These are the topics to be investigated and variables of the research. You can also enumerate here the sub-concepts and sub-variables of your study. The second question is where. This is the setting or locale or the place where your data will be gathered and where the experiment will be conducted. The third one is when. Basically, the time frame. This is the expected time or months of completion of your study. The fourth question you must answer is the why. The general objectives or the purpose of conducting the experiment. You can also put here the objectives you have written on your statement of the problem. And also don't forget to answer the who because you also need to state on your S&D the population, those included and those who are not, and the sampling you have used. And lastly, to complete your S&D, you must answer the how the research is to be conducted. This includes the methodology, research instruments, and even the research design. Basically, there is no rules on writing your S&D. You can combine them in one paragraph as long as you answer all of the things I have discussed because those are the things that your reader must need to know for your scope and delimitation. And as I've said earlier, you can also include here the limitation of your study. Next slide. But if you want your S&D to be more formal, you can split them into two paragraphs. For your scoop, you can start with the phrases like this. This study is to focus on, this study covers the, or this study aims to blah blah. And for the limitation, you can start with this study does not cover, this study is limited to, and the following has been excluded from this study and etc. Next slide. So this is an example of scope and delimitation. Non-state dyan lahat yung nasabi ko kanina kung paano magsulat ng scope and delimitation. Mapapansin na dun sa last paragraph, nandun yung limitation ng study nila. I just forgot kung ano yung exact title ng research na to, but ito ay isang experimental research about orally presented stories and audio recorded stories na pinagko-compare kung ano yung mas best na method teaching. Next slide. And that's all for writing the scope and the limitation of experimental research. Another thing that your paper must have is the definition of terms. So let's discuss about it now. Next slide. The definition of terms is somewhat like the mini dictionary of your study that contains important terminologies and concepts in your paper that needs to be defined. Some people consider this as the minor portion of the whole research paper, but actually this is also significant as this one serves as the guide of your readers to understand your study. So, why is it important to include on your research paper the definition of terms? Because through this, the jargons or terms are clarified and clearly defined for the readers. Yes, as the researcher, you also need to consider your readers, especially if they are outside of your field or discipline, because not everyone has the same understanding or meaning for a one word or term. So before we proceed on how to write the definition of terms, I want you guys to know that there's a two types of definition of terms: the conceptual definition and the operational definition. These two were considered as the methods on how you can give a brief explanation on the words or terms that was written on your research paper. Next slide. Okay, for conceptual definition, this is the basic dictionary definition. It tells what a concept or the term means. In other words, we are just simply giving the universal meaning of the terms as understood by many people. And it is also known as theoretical definition. And the second type is the operational definition. This one refers on how the term is applied on your study or how to measure the variables of your research in terms of specific processes, tests, and measurements used. Next slide. On writing the definition of terms, only those words or phrases that have special meanings on your study are to be defined. You do not need to include every single words written on your paper, only those words that seem so important in your study. So what are those words I am pertaining to define? First, the important words indicated on your research title, probably the variables you have used. So it's a must that those variables were given a proper definition. Second is the technical terms applied or used in your paper. Identify those unfamiliar words, uncommon acronyms, or jargons in your research and give them a meaning to avoid confusion. And include also the treatments, measurements, data analysis, and etc. Next slide. Um, Okay, so remember po pala, you can define terms conceptually, operationally, or it can be both. But there are cases kasi that some of the researchers only use operational definition on their paper. You can also acknowledge the source if your definition are from the dictionaries, books, and etc. Next reminder is your definition should be short, clear, and unambiguous. Diba the main goal of having a definition of terms on your paper is for you as a researcher and for your readers to connect. So as much as possible, make it clear, brief, direct to the point, not doubtful, and understandable. And of course, since your definition of terms serve as the mini dictionary of your paper, much better if it is in an alphabetically arranged. Next slide. So this is an example of definition of terms. Mapapansin dyan yung every words ay nabigyan nila ng meaning conceptually and operationally. Yun nga lang, hindi nila na alphabetically arrange yung every words. Next slide. Okay, another part of the manuscript are the frameworks. Your research paper must contain two frameworks, the theoretical framework and the other one was your conceptual framework. Pero let's focus first sa theoretical framework. Um, when we say theoretical framework, it is dealing with theories that serve as the building blocks or skeleton for the foundation or basis of the study. Here, the researcher discusses and cites the related theories that probably could help their study in more empirical and understandable way. And because there are different theories about your topic, so it also involves evaluating, comparing, and selecting. Another thing you can put the theoretical framework in chapter 1, but in some cases others including this on chapter 3 of the paper. So having theory in our study makes our research study more scientific and empirical. This is the goal of theoretical framework because having this on your paper helps you to strengthen your study by explaining the theories that supports your research and showing that your research is grounded in established ideas. Also, it permits your readers to evaluate your topic or the research problem critically. Next slide. These are the steps that we can use as the guide on writing a theoretical framework. First of all, examine the research problem and consider the key variables in your research. These are the key concepts that you need to identify and pick out. You can look back from your statement of the problem and research questions and consider the terms or variables from there. Next step is to review your related literature and choose the theory that seems applicable to your study. Then compare and critically evaluate the approaches that the different authors have proposed and select the best that fits the aims of your study. Then discuss the theory, just justify why this is the case, like how was it related to your present study. Explain and show how your research fit in. Next slide. So aim to do the following on writing and discussing your theoretical framework. Test whether a theory holds in a specific context. Use theory as basis for interpreting your result. Critique and challenge a theory. And of course, you can combine different theories in a new or unique way. Also include this. Remember, in discussing your theory, do not forget to mention its title and its author or proponents as well. And then explain the theoretical principle behind the theories you have chosen. And in concluding part, mention the relationship or the relevance of the theories in your present study. For the structure, there is no specific rules on how to write theoretical framework. The most crucial thing is to create a logical and clear structure. Next slide. This is an example of theoretical framework. Um, ayun, nag-start sila sa hypo, hyp, hypnotic trance. Then, actually, mas marami pa to, hindi lang masyadong nailagay. Nilagay din nila yung about sa theory about learning. Ganun. Next slide. And usually, after the theoretical framework, next to it is the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework, on the other hand, is your own idea on how you will investigate the variables in your study that is based on the theoretical framework. It illustrates what the researchers expect to find in the research and explain the major relevant variables well in the study. Conceptual framework guides the researcher by giving clear direction to the research. It maps out how the variables might connect and relate to each other. So basically, it is a diagram, the simplest, easiest, and effective way to represent the relationship of the variables. So remember that do not create conceptual framework out of nowhere. There are things we need to consider on creating it. As the researcher, you must conduct comprehensive reviews of literature that supports your conceptual framework. In this way, it will make it more credible. Next slide. Here are the things that we need to consider to create a conceptual framework. Unang-una, consider your research title or topic, of course. Due to the variables, the independent and dependent variables. Then choose how is it related to each other. Next is your research question because it is an essential part of your study where it serves as the focus or or path where your study is leading to. You can develop your conceptual framework based on your review of literatures then. And in creating conceptual framework, we are not advised to use shapes based on what we just want. There are proper guidelines and shapes that we must use. Like for the variable names, we have to put it into rectangles or boxes, and the variables have to be connected with lines and arrows. But the arrowheads may differ depending on the nature of the relationship of the variables. Next slide. For the arrows, the single head arrow is for one directional relationship. This means that variable A affects variable B, but the variable B does not affect variable A. And for two directional relationship, the arrowhead is double headed. This means that the variable A affects variable B and variable B also affects the variable A. Next slide. To illustrate well the diagram or paradigm, we have the term research paradigm, which has different types. So to have a good and better conceptual framework, it consists of a research paradigm or model to visualize your concepts, and under it was the explanation of it in a paragraph form. A conceptual framework can be defined in many different ways through the types of research paradigm. One of the common type is the IVDB model or the independent and dependent variable model. This model is used in experiment-based studies. The independent variable is need to investigate whether it affects the dependent variable or not. You can also put another box for moderating variables if your study has more than two variables pa. Next, second type is the IPO model or the input process output model. This one is largely used to isolate the factor or major variable that causes the problem or the phenomenon under investigation. On the first box, input your variables. Then on the second box, indicate or mention there what will be the process. And for the last box is the possible output after it was processed. You can also include a feedback. Next Next is predictor criterion model. It is a use when relating or assessing the influence between two or more variables. And then next model is P model. It is used naman in research studies that propose a program or any intervention measure. Um, we also have POM model or proposed original model. Di na nailagay kasi this one naman ay ginagamit when the researcher decides and presents an original paradigm. Next slide. So this is an example of conceptual framework. Um, yung type na to is POM model or yung sinabi ko kanina na proposed original model. Yung researcher kasi dito is gumawa sila ng sarili nilang model kasi they're comparing two variables which is yung um, orally presented stories and audio recorded stories. Kaya yung arrow is nakatutok dun sa gitna which is yung method teaching. Pinag-compare yung dalawang variables para malaman kung ano ba yung mas okay na method teaching sa sa paaralan. Dun naman sa kabilang picture, dun yung yung explanation nila about the diagram na ginawa nila. Katulad ng sa kanina na mabubuo lang yung conceptual framework pag meron kang research paradigm plus explanation. Yun lang, thank you. Ito pa pala, yung theoretical framework versus conceptual framework. So, to summarize the difference of the two frameworks, kapag sinabing theoretical framework, based siya sa existing theory or general theories. While yung conceptual framework naman is something that you can develop based on the theory, specific direction on how will you carry out your research, na nagpapakita sa mga readers mo ng plan or process ng study mo through visual. Yun lang.
Hi, I'm Shane Digo, and I'm going to discuss review of related literature and synthesis. The, li- the literature review is a critical examination of existing research that is relevant to the work that you are doing. This overview identifies prominent research trends while also evaluating the overall strengths and weaknesses of existing research. The study of literature is important because it, at its most basic, improves reading skills. From this involved reading of quality literature, a person then develops the writing skills as the two go hand in hand. Basically, the best writers are avid readers, and literature allows a person to step back in time and learn about life on earth from the ones who walked before us. We can gather a better understanding of culture and have a greater appreciation of them. We learn through the ways history is recorded in the forms of manuscript and through speech itself. Next slide. Purpose of literature review. First is provide historical context for a research topic, demonstrate the significance of a topic, demonstrate knowledge of a topic problem, and to carve out a space for future work and place yourself in scholarly conversation. The purpose of a literature review is to gain an understanding of existing research and debate relevant to particular topic or area of study, and to present the knowledge in the form of written report. Conducting a literature review helps you build your knowledge in your field. Next slide. Characteristic of an effective literature review. In addition to serving the aforementioned purpose, an effective literature review provides a critical overview of existing research, outlining key research trends, identifying and evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of individual studies and world existing research as a whole, identifying potential knowledge gaps, identifying the needs for current and or future research projects. A literature review can be informative, critical, and useful synthesis of a particular topic. Regardless of the type, a good review is characterized by the author efforts to evaluate and critically analyze the relevant work in the field. Next slide. These are the steps of literature review process. First is plan ahead of time by determining the focus, type, scope, and discipline of the review you intend to write. Regarding and research, gather and read up on current research on your topic. Choose only the sources that are most pertinent to your project. Analyzing means summarizing, synthesizing, critiquing, and comparing your sources in order to evaluate the field of study as a whole. Number 4, drafting entails creating a thesis or claims about existing research and deciding how to organize your material. Next is revising. Revise and finalize your paper structural, stylistic, and grammatical issue. Remember that this process is not always a linear process, depending on the size and scope of your literature review. You may find yourself returning to some of these steps repeatedly as you continue to focus to your project or research. Next slide. Literature review format. Introduction. Provide an overview of the topic, theme, or issue. Identify your specific area of focus. Describe your methodology and rationale. Briefly discuss the overall trends in the published scholarship in this area. Establish your reason for writing a review. Your introduction should clearly explain the overall research topic and depth of the information to be presented. It often also explains the type of sources that will be used. Next slide. Body. Find the best organizational method for your review. Summarize your sources by providing the most relevant information, respectfully and objectively critique and evaluate the studies. Use the quotation sparingly and only if appropriate. The body of the review containing the discussion of sources and finally a conclusion. Next slide. Conclusion and or recommendation section to the end paper. Summarize the major findings of the sources that you review, remembering to keep the focus on your topic. Evaluate the current state of scholarship in this area. Identify any areas for further research. Conclude by making a connection between your topic and some larger area of study, such as discipline. The conclusion should give a summary of the main agreement and disagreement in the literature. Any gaps or for further research, your overall perspective on the topic. Next slide. Synthesis. Simply put, synthesizing is the process of combining two or more elements instead of summarizing the main point of each source individually. You combine the ideas and finding of the multiple sources to make an overall point. Synthesis means to combine a number of different pieces into a whole. Synthesis is about concisely summarizing and linking different sources in order to review the literature on a topic, make, make recommendation, and connect your practice to the research. Next slide. Organize your sources. You have a lot of information to work through after gathering the relevant literature, but you have no idea how it all fits together. Before you begin in writing, you must organize your notes so that you can see the relationship between the sources. Making a table of your notes is one way to start synthesizing the literature. There are few different ways to organize this depends on your topic and the type of literature you're dealing with. Next slide. Four steps. Next po. This the example of synthesis matrix. Synthesis matrix is a chart that allows a researcher to sort and categorize the different arguments presented on an issue. Across the top of the chart that are spaces to recorded sources, and along the side on an issue of the chart are the spaces to record the main point of arguments on the topic at hand. And And that is, next slide po. Synthesis matrix. Next slide. Makita. Ulit. Next po. Outline your structure. You must decide how you will group them and the order in which you will discuss them. For shorter papers, your outline should simply identify the main point of each paragraph. You can organize your discussion chronologically if your sources span a wide time period and you discovered patterns in how researchers approach the topic over time. Next slide po. Simply summarize each paper in chronological order, instead group articles in time periods. Identify what they have in common as well as signaling important turning points or develop in the literature. If the literature cover a wide range of topic, you can arrange it thematically. A synthesis collect information from multiple sources and then combine them together to make a new whole. The new whole is your that explain your point of view while analyzing both sides of the issue. Next slide po. That is another example of outline structure. Next slide po. Write paragraph with topic sentence. A synthesis differs from summary that incorporate information from multiple sources. The simplest way to think about this is that each paragraph should discuss a few different sources and the overall point of the paragraph should be condensed into one sentence. You can use one topic sentence to link back to previous paragraph, highlight a point of debate or critique for effective synthesis. You need an introductory paragraph or synthesis. Identify a strong position. Test your position by writing a draft thesis statement. Write at least one but better two more sentences, expanding and elaborating the writing of your position. Next slide po. And last is revise, edit, and proofread. Synthesizing literature, like any other pieces of academic writing, does not happen all at once. It requires redrafting, revising, editing, and proofreading your work. Revision involves analyzing the global level and paragraph level organization of the document and making changes to your draft, paragraph, and sentence level to ensure that the document addresses its purpose. Yun lang po. Thank you.
So, hi again. I'm Jasmine Marie Cruzada, and I'm one of the reporters uh, that will explain the chapter 3 or the methodology. So, next slide. Next slide po ulit. So, methodology includes research design, hypothesis, source of data, participants of the study, data to be gathered, and lastly, the statistical treatment. Next slide. So, for the introduction of methodology, First, what is methodology? So it describes the research plan and the particular methods that you chooses to carry it out so that one can research questions and or investigate the hypothesis. So the methodology is the most important part of the proposal, especially of the proposal. A detailed methodology is really needed or highly required for all proposed studies, and all should be written in the form of future tense. Second, methodology is your thesis or project recipe. Recipe. So guys, we all know that recipe is needed or in producing a certain foods, dishes, and even drinks. So recipes are the guides of the cooking. So let's say recipe has three components, and let's try to relate it to the parts of the methodology. So first component is the list of ingredients. So in research proposal, list of ingredients can be the counterpart of research design, sampling technique, research instrument, source of data, what else? Sampling, no, statistical treatment of data. I guess that's it for the first component. Okay, second component will be the amount of the ingredients. So how many? Ilan? So again, in research proposal or in methodology, it can be the counterpart of the participants or the subjects of a study. So of course, it is important for the researchers to state how many subjects are there in their study. And in addition to that, why did you choose those certain samples in your studies? Okay, last component or the third component is the preparational instructions. So let's say, kompleto ko nga sa list and the amount of ingredients that you needed to be able to cook this type of dish or food. But then, di mo naman alam kung paano siya lulutuin or what will be the process of cooking it or cooking that certain type of dish. So of course, you need preparational instructions for you to be successful in cooking it. So of course, in the counterpart of it will be the data to be gathered or the data gathering procedure that contains of how will you execute your study or the step by step process of how will you gather those data that you want to get or that is needed to supplement your study. So again, recipe is guide for the cooking, whereas methodology is the guide for a research or research proposal. So again, methodology is describing the steps of how will you conduct your research or how will you design it. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, let's try to answer a few questions about methodology. First question. No. Let's stick to the questions. Number 1 and 2 muna tayo. Number 1 and 2, Kath. Yan. So first question is how detailed methodology should be. I've said earlier that it is highly required for the researchers to write their methodology in a well-written manner. But why? Mina, bakit? It is because the readers should have enough information so that if naging future researcher or researcher sila sa future, they could replicate your research with uh, or with the same or using the same or similar sample of the population and arrive at the same results, or it will directly contradict current conventional information. Number 2, what is it again you are doing? So here you must write an introductory part wherein the purpose and the objective of your study are stated or should be stated. Parang it is a brief explanation of what will be your study. Of course, it is necessary for the researchers to have an introductory part kasi sabihin na natin your readers are really interested in your research or especially in your methodology. So, writing those will prevent them to go back and forth through chapter 1 to revisit the purpose and the objectives of the study. Parang that introductory paragraph will reintroduce the readers about your study. So, okay, next slide. Okay, for the last question, how the chapter title methodology should be written in the paper. The chapter title methodology should be written at the center of the page. An introduction statement is written after 3 single spaces below the title, stating the content of this chapter. So here is an example. Methodology, nasa center ng page. This chapter will discuss the research design, sampling technique, description of the participants, collection of data, research instrument, and methods of analysis. Second paragraph. This study will determine the effectiveness of blended instruction in the teaching of psychological statistics by comparing the students' performance in their post-test course and in their final grades. So in first paragraph or sentences, the researcher stated the content of the methodology, and in second paragraph or sentence were the purpose and objective of the study. So that's how will you write the introduction statement of methodology. So next slide. Next slide. Na-stuck ako sa questions number 3. Yan. Methodology includes research methodology, wherein it have descriptive, correlational, experimental, documentary analysis, and the like. And for our case, of course, we will be using the experimental research. Research design, this is the description of the design of the research that you will adopt in the study. So we have the single end design, true experimental design, and quasi-experimental design. So you need to choose what type and subtype of experimental design you will use or adopt in your study. Hypothesis, these are the suggested answers to a problem. So we have two general kinds. Alternative hypothesis that is stated in a positive statement that is denoted by age A, and the null hypothesis that is stated in a negative statement that is denoted by age O. And if I'm not mistaken, in research, the hypothesis or the null hypothesis were the one that is always stated. So either you will reject or fail to reject it. So we also have the sources of data wherein it have primary and secondary, sampling techniques, subjects of the study, data gathering procedures, statistical analysis or treatment of data wherein it have descriptive, inferential, statistical software, and data analysis that is usually used in a qualitative research. So that's it for the introduction of the methodology.
Hello, I am Mary Angela C. De Paz, and I'll be discussing parts of methodology as research design, hypothesis, and sources of data. For research design, next slide. A study said that experimental research design is to enable researchers to estimate the effect of an experimental treatment. So as we all know, experimental research can be done in various settings, like in the class, laboratory, or in the field. It is the researcher's job to choose a suitable research design to determine the validity of the conclusions drawn in the study. We've already discussed different types of research design, so we'll just go through several. So next slide. Next slide po. Okay, for the first one, we have small n design or the single case experimental design. This type of research is conducted to one or few subjects or a small sample. It is used to draw detailed and rich findings from the observations. So internal validity of this is good because there are little individual differences, but external validity might be a problem. So we have several types. Next slide. So for the types, we have AB design, ABA design, and multiple baseline design. Next slide, we have AB design, which is composed of, AB design, which is composed of two phases, A phase or the baseline or the pre-treatment phase, wherein treatment is not yet introduced, and B phase or the treatment phase, wherein treatment will then be introduced, as you can see in the picture in the next slide. Okay, for the next slide, for ABA design, yeah. ABA design is composed of three phases. The first two phases same as the AB design, but with the addition of withdrawal phase. So as you can see in the next slide, here in the next slide, we have an example. After the baseline, we will have the treatment phase and then another baseline where the treatment will be then removed. So for last type, we have multiple baseline design. Next slide. So multiple baseline design is the design composed of baseline phases in different lengths and different paces that starts at different times. So next slide. This design can have different participants, different variables, and different settings. Okay, for our next research design, we have quasi-experimental design, with quasi meaning partial or half or pseudo. So this is the closest to a true experimental design, except that it has no random assignment. This aims to establish a cause and effect relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So let's analyze this example. So in a mental facility, you are not given the permission to randomly assign patients to treatments. However, you notice that the psychotherapists in the clinic have tried new treatment to a group of patients, while others who treat their patients have chosen to stick to their normal protocol. So the researchers uses non-random method to assign subjects to groups. They also don't have control over the treatment and uses pre-existing groups that receive the different treatment. So you can use these pre-existing groups to study the symptom progression of the patients that receive the new therapy compared to those that receive their standard course of treatment. Although they are not randomly assigned to their groups, the differences will be formed from the treatment and not from the other variables. So that's how a quasi experimental design is. So next, lastly, for our research design, we have true experimental design. So this is the most accurate type of experimental research design, as it uses statistical analysis to support or reject a hypothesis. So this research design must contain a control group, a variable that can be manipulated, um, and the distribution must be random. This type also regarded to be the only experimental research design that can assess cause and effect relationship. So we have several types. Next slide. And for our types, we have post-test only control group design, pre-test post-test control group design, Solomon 4 group design, factorial design, crossover design, or repeat measures design. Next slide for our post-test only control group design. Two randomly assigned groups, namely as the experimental and control groups, are assigned, but only the experimental group will receive a treatment, but both will be post-tested. So a conclusion is then drawn from the differences between these groups. Okay, for the next one, we have pre-test, post-test control group design. So experimental and control groups are both formed and pre-tested for the independent variable, but only the experimental group will receive the treatment. And finally, both groups will undergo post-test. So post-tests are carried out to measure the effects of independent variable in the dependent one. Next, we have Solomon 4 group design. Okay, so there are randomly four groups, two experimental and two control groups. Only two are pre-tested, and then one of the pre-tested and non-pre-tested will receive the treatment. All four groups will then receive the post-test. So as you can see in the table in the next slide, the result of the process will demonstrate the effects of the dependent variables than to the effects of the independent variable. This design is a combination of the two aforementioned designs and will eliminate potential sources of error. Okay, next we have factorial design. Two or more independent variables or factors are simultaneously manipulated to observe their effects on the dependent variables. This allowed the researchers to test two or more hypotheses in a single project. Lastly, we have crossover design or repeat measures design. So this design requires high similarity between subjects and equal distribution of features as different orders of treatment are randomly manipulated to the subjects and they are assigned to more than one treatment. So in this design, the subjects are their own control groups. Crossover designs have one flaw as the subject's first experience with the first treatment may affect their next treatment. So next slide. Here we have an example on how to write it on your paper. Next slide. Yeah. For our example, we used a study. So in this study, the researcher uses experimental research with quantitative approach. So as you can see, the researchers proceeded to introduce what type of research design was used in their study. You can see furthermore, they also included the aim and the goal of their study. So let's see how it should be written. Next slide, po. Yeah, so the most important part is write the type of research design you will use. And then you must include the overall aims and approach of your study. So next we have hypothesis. So hypotheses are the precise, testable statement of what the researchers predict of what will be the outcome of the study. So this involves proposing possible relationship between the independent and dependent variables. So as mentioned earlier, we have two types of research hypothesis. The first one is the alternative hypothesis. Yeah. So alternative hypothesis states that there is a relationship between two variables being studied. This predicts what changes will take place in the dependent variable and the independent variable is manipulated. This also reflects that the results are not because of chance and that they are significant in terms of supporting the theory being investigated. This suggests a significant relationship or difference between variables. So next we have null hypothesis. So null came from the German word which means zero. So that states that there is no relationship between two variables being studied. The independent variable did not elicit a change in the dependent variable. So this states that the results are not significant in terms of supporting the idea being tested. So we have several examples. Let's analyze example number one. Yeah. So a teacher gives constant positive words of encouragement on a group of students as to see if this will affect their results on their major exams. while the other group does not receive any. So we have two hypotheses. So for our alternative hypothesis, the words of encouragement help the students to have good results for their major exam. For our null hypothesis, it states that the result of the major exam was not affected by the words of the encouragement by the teacher. So after the experimentation, the teacher saw that the words of encouragement did not affect their students' scores. Therefore, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. So the words of encouragement given by the teacher on their students have no significant effect on their major examination. Next slide for our second example. This corresponds to the previous example for the research design. So you can just read through this and see how they wrote their hypothesis. So yeah, this is how it was written in their paper. And next slide po. How it should, so let's see how should it be written. Next slide po. First is to restate your hypothesis. You can restate it in a form of question, like is there a difference between your independent variable, or in a form of statement, or lastly in a form of null hypothesis, like there is no significant relationship or difference between your independent and dependent variable. Next, you must include your statistical methods and instruments that made you draw this conclusion. So demonstrate how this statistical test help the rejection or acceptance of your hypothesis. So kailangan we write our hypothesis knowing that our readers know statistics. So next we have sources of data. So as we all know, data collection is a crucial part of any research. So in experimental research, which is primarily a quantitative research, mostly the data to be gathered are from the experiments the researchers will conduct. They are collected through active intervention by the researchers to produce and measure, change, or to create difference when a variable is altered. So we have primary source of data. So it is a process of collecting data at the main source. The data collected by the researcher for the purpose of the study. So it refers to the data originated from the researchers for the first time. So examples of this are surveys, observations, questionnaires, and interviews. Okay, for a secondary source of data, next slide. They are the data that comes from the analysis of the primary data. They are the existing data collected by the earlier researchers or investigators that the researchers can use. So example of this are government publications, websites, books, journals, articles, and internal records. So we have different methods in data collection for experimental research. So the first one is observational study. So this type of study is carried out for a long period of time. It measures and observes the variables of interest without changing existing conditions. So this may be too risky, especially in medical field, as it may lead to death or worse medical conditions. So we also have simulations. This uses mathematical, physical, or computer models to replicate real-life process. This procedure is used when the actual situation is too expensive, dangerous, or impractical. This is not commonly used in laboratory-based research as those involve chemical process. So lastly, we have survey, of course, used to gather relevant data about the characteristic of the population. It is consist of group of questions prepared to be answered by the subjects. So here, for example, this is how it was written in their study. Yeah. Yeah, you can just read through that. And thank you.
So, hi again, I'm Jasmine Maricuzada, and I am discussing sampling technique, subjects of the study, data gathering procedure, and lastly, the statistical treatment of data. So, next slide. Okay, sampling technique is a technique of selecting individual members or a subset of the population to make statistical inferences from them and estimate characteristics of the whole population. So this refers to the technique that the researchers will employ in order to determine the number of subjects of the study or the samples from a given populations. So sample, of course, must be the representative of population, so it must share the same characteristics in your population of interest. In experimental research, only use probability sampling methods. So you must only use probability sampling. So here is an example of different probability sampling methods. We have the simple random sampling. No, yeah. Uh, Cluster sampling, systematic sampling, and stratified random sampling. So those are the most common types of probability sampling methods that were commonly used by the researchers. So in Mom Army's lecture, we also have the within household sampling and the random digit sampling. So next slide. So okay, I'm sorry because no, I greatly emphasize that we need to only use probability sampling methods, and yet I put convenience sampling in my example. So for that, I'm sorry. So wag niyo ako tutularan ha. So okay, back to the back to the discussion. Kung naaalala niyo pa yung aking introductory part sa methodology, yung determine the effectiveness of blended instruction in the teaching of psychological statistics. So, ito yun. So, throughout the methodology, isang example lang ng study yung gagamitin ko. So, let's read it. Example, convenience sampling will be utilized in this research. Since the researcher teaches in the College of Arts and Sciences, she will use psychology students as her subjects and respondents. The 6 groups will be selected on the basis of her comparability that will be computed statistically. After determining them, the researcher will subject the 3 sections to blended instruction and the other 3 to the traditional learning. So, yung researcher is also a teacher that teaches in the College of Arts and Sciences. So, dahil convenient sampling yung ginamit niya, so she will get sample that is most convenient for her. And for this, she will use her psychology students. So, we need to have a technique for us to determine the number of the sample. Kasi hindi naman agad-agad, di ba, kailangan mong ito lang gusto ko number of samples ko. Diba? A big no-no yun, lalo na kung gagamitin mo is probability sampling method. And may nasabi akong word kanina na technique, no? And referring to that word, what I mean is we need to use formulas or sample sizes that we need na commonly na ginagamit. Ano nga ba yung mga formulas na yon? We have the Sloven's formula, Cochrane's formula, and we also have the SPSS or the statistical package for the social sciences, that is a software in the computer. So, ganyan isulat yung sampling technique. So, next slide. Participants, subjects, respondents of the study. So these are the people whom the researchers select for their studies. So participants, subjects, respondents. Next slide. So it refers to the individuals or group of individuals, organization, institution, communities that will be involved, or the group of people that you have selected as the subjects or participants or respondents in the utilization of your study. So kung mapapansin nyo, diba, I put distinction between the participants, subjects, and respondents. So ito na naman tayo. Mina, bakit na naman? Hindi ba parang iisa lang naman yung meaning at purpose niyan? So, let's know one by one the key differences of these 3. So, first, participants are usually in qualitative research. So, from the word participate, These are the group of individuals that participates and answer questions that is usually in qualitative study or qualitative research. So examples of that are the interviews and the focus groups. Because qualitative studies are more like in-depth in nature than in a quantitative studies. Basically because the participants in a qualitative study contributes more or usually active than respondents to a survey or subjects in an experiment. So the participants obviously generally gives more much more detailed answers than respondents would in a survey and subjects would in an experiment. Second, respondents are usually in quantitative research. Okay, so from the words, no, so from the word response or reply, typically these are the group of individuals that responds or answer in a questionnaire that is usually used in a quantitative research. So respondents generally respond to the questions asked by the researchers, no more, no less. So nagkasagot lang sila. So hindi so wala silang parang hindi sila more active than the participants would in a qualitative study. So last is the subject. So subjects, these are usually in experimental research. So these are the group of people that is involved in the researchers experiment that is usually in quantitative research also. Subjects can be either experimental or control group, depende sa researchers. The word subject is a term that is used more in science because subjects generally encompasses or being a passive. So subjects are typically observed and or being investigated rather than being actively answer to questions or respond to the questionnaires by the researchers. So I hope na kuha nyo yung key differences of those three terms. So next slide. So how should it be written? So it is important to state your number of subjects or respondents and who they are. Also, the researchers need to explain how the number will be decided upon or how they were selected. So, yep, next slide. Okay, okay, let's read the example. In these experimental studies, 6 classes sections of CAPSU psychology instructors will be selected to participate in the process. 3 sections will comprise the experimental group, and the remaining 3 will be the control group. Students receiving blended instruction will be chosen as experimental group of the study. Those receiving classroom instruction will be the control group. The subjects and respondents of the study will be the third-year psychology students of Cavite State University main campus. A total of 240 students will be chosen to participate in the experiment. 3 sections will be exposed to blended instruction, so there will be the experimental group, while the other 3 will be exposed to the classroom or traditional instruction. Hereby, there will be the control group. The experimental group will total 120 students and the control group also 120 students. Therefore, sections 1 to 3 will comprise the experimental group and sections 4 to 6 will comprise the control group. So, ano natin, di ba? Isa-isahin natin. So, how many subjects are there? Or what is the total? So, there will be 240 students that will be chosen to participate in the experiment. So, how they were selected? So, they will be selected based on the section or the 6 classes of the psychology instructors of Cavite State University main campus. And 3 sections will be the experimental group and remaining 3 will be the control group. So lastly, who they were. So the subjects will be third-year psychology students that are currently studying in CABSU main campus. So diba, you notice guys that I use the terms, so I use the two terms, subjects and respondents. So bakit? You will know later. So I hope na nakuha nyo kung paano siya isulat. So kung hindi, balikan nyo lang tong slide na to. So next. Okay, data gathering procedure. So data is an extremely important factor when it comes to gaining insights about a specific study, research, or even sa tao. Data is regarded as a vital component of all the systems that make up our world today. So data gathering procedure, it is defined as a systematic method of obtaining, observing, measuring, and analyzing accurate information to support research conducted by groups. So next slide. So in data gathering procedure, the main question is how we will be able, or how will the researchers be able to gather those needed data. So data gathering procedure is also a listing of different parameters or information that will be gathered, including the technique, process, instruments that are needed to get the correct data. So in a research instrument, there should also be a description of a research instrument that will be used in gathering data. So research instruments come in many forms, such as interview schedule, checklists, questionnaires, and the like. So let's say example, you used or adopt a questionnaire. So it must have description, as you can see, validity, reliability. Also, you can state a few examples, and of course, the scoring or how will it be scored. But let's say you developed or you construct a new questionnaire. So you must include how it is pretested, how it will be distributed, how it will be validated, the retrieval, the collation, and the like. Also, there is the research tools or the devices that you will use to obtain such data, like cameras, smartphones, computers, voice recorder, and the like. Yun nga. Let's go to the main question of how we will be able. No. Yeah. So let's go to the main question of how we will be able to gather the needed data. So what method should we use in order to supplement the needed data? So here I put the three methods, the most common method of how we will get those information. So first is the direct or interview method. Researchers gather information by asking questions to the interviewee. So the researchers has a direct contact with the interviewee. The researchers gathers information by asking questions directly to the interviewee. Examples of that are, as I've said, interviews, focus groups, and the like. So the advantage of using direct method is that researcher can get more accurate answers since clarifications can be made if the participants does not understand the questions na tinatanong mo. One disadvantage rather of the direct method is that this method is costly and of course time consuming. Okay, second is the indirect or questionnaire method. So researchers make use of a written questionnaire that will be distributed to the respondents either by personal, mailed, or online. So basically, it is the pen and paper method type. Ito yung basically na ginagamit natin, no? So the most common use in this method are the surveys and the questionnaires. In their most foundational sense, this means of obtaining data from targeted respondents with the goal of generalizing those results to a broader public or to the population that is represented by the sample of your study. So the advantages of using indirect method is that researchers can save on time and money in gathering the information needed because this method can be given to a large number of respondents at the same time. So, totoo naman, diba? So, one disadvantage of it is that we cannot expect that all distributed questionnaires will be retrieved because some respondents simply ignore the questionnaires, unlike in direct method wherein the participants can clarify questions. Here, in indirect method, clarifications cannot be made if the respondent does not understand the question. So, yun yung greatest disadvantage ng indirect method. So, last method is the experimental method. So, for this case, this is the main method that we will use to obtain data. So, experimental method, researchers utilize this method to find out the causal relationship or the temporal relationship. So, experimental data are collected through active intervention by the researcher to produce and measure changes or to create differences when a variable is altered. So, independent variable will be the variable that is being manipulated or altered, and it must produce a change in the dependent variable. So, kasi yung dependent variable, it is what the researchers will measure to. So, basically determines temporal relationship or causal relationship as nakikita nyo naman. So, one advantage of experimental method is that it goes beyond plain description of data. Diba? And one disadvantage of it is that care should be or researchers should be cautious, or it implies great care should be taken on making conclusions to the result of the experiment. So now that we know the different methods of obtaining the needed data to support your study, now we state or list the step-by-step process of how you should or you will execute your study. So, okay, next slide. So, yeah, this is examples. So first, okay, ganito yung pagkakasulat ng research instrument. So the following instruments will be used in the conduct of the research. First, the teacher-made tests. These are the achievement tests that will evaluate quantitatively the students' performance in a controlled experimental group. This also comprise the pre-test and post-tests. Second is the questionnaire. The questionnaire will be used to assess the students' perception of online instructions, including the electronic materials that to be used in the presentation. So, next slide. Validation of instruments. So, the 10 expert faculty members will validate the questionnaire. Their corrections and suggestions will be incorporated in the draft or for the next stage of validation. Yeah. The 10 students who will not be included as the final respondents will be subject to answer the questionnaires. Their responses will be tested for reliability. So nasabi ko nga, validation of instruments, kasi nga, let's say you constructed or developed a new questionnaire to be answered by the students. So of course, or your samples or your whatever your sample will be. So of course, it needs to be validated. So para it really measures what it purports to measure. So, okay? Next slide. So, I think medyo madami-dami to. But yeah, let's read it na lang. So, in the procedure of data gathering, so pwede siyang gawin yung stage, day, or and the like, kung ano man ang gusto nyo or paano nyo siya i-conduct. So, this study will consist of 8 stages. Stage 1 deals with the training of psychology instructors to blended instruction. All psychology instructors in the DSH department will be trained in a computer laboratory for a week. However, in the final selection of instructors, only 3 instructors will be included, whose classes will be identified in the experimental procedures. Next slide. Stage 2 deals with the use of online instructional materials. The Google Meet will be used for virtual classroom. Other websites to be used are the Quizlet, Quizzes, and the Zoom. Kavzu e-learning will be utilized as the student site for conferencing with their teachers and peers during asynchronous sessions. This will be their main site, like yung ginagamit natin, which includes their quizzes, exams, and laboratory exercises are all linked here. Next slide. Stage 3 deals with the construction and content validation of the questionnaires and materials. So dito sa stage 3 yung validation of instrument. So the 10 expert teachers in the DSH department will be requested to validate the questionnaires and the teacher-made tests. So the questionnaires will be used for a dry run to 10 students will be subjected to a reliability test. Stage 4. So, medyo madami talaga. Yeah. Stage 4 deals with establishing comparability between the experimental and control groups through a pre-test. Stage 5 deals with the training and orienting of experimental groups to online navigation of the virtual classroom. The 3 sections that will be selected as the experimental group will be trained and oriented to the blended instruction format, like kung ano nararanasan natin ngayon. Stage 6 deals with the actual conduct of the study using blended and traditional instruction. So, diba, ang dami pang stage na kailangang pagdaanan para lang makapag-conduct talaga, makapagsimulang mag-conduct ng study. So, I guess, next slide will be the last 2 stage. So stage 7 deals with the administration of the post-test to the control and experimental groups and gathering of data in the post-test and final grades in psychological statistics. Stage 8 deals with the tabulating, analyzing, and interpreting of the data gathered using several statistical tools. So, ulitin natin, procedure of data gathering will be the process of how we will be able to gather data or how the study will be executed and be completed. So, diba, if you still remember, this is our, I think, third component of our recipe, which is the preparational instruction. So, ulitin ko ulit. So, kompleto nga yung yung first and second components mo. But then, di mo naman alam kung paano siya lulutuin or gagawin. So, for that, kung wala kang professional instruction, so, basically, you will be unsuccessful or hindi mo maluluto yung gusto mong lutuin. So, ganun din sa research. Kung wala kang procedure of data gathering, syempre, magiging unsuccessful yung study mo kasi wala kang parang wala kang process kung paano mo siya i-conduct. Because you lack ways on how you will execute it. So, data gathering procedure must be planned or cautiously planned thoroughly for it to be successful. So, guys, dapat talagang parang cautiously planned or yung data gathering procedure nyo is dapat talagang specific. It is written in a well manner para alam nyo kung ano yung gagawin or kung paano nyo makukuha yung data na kailangan sa subject nyo. Okay? That is for the data gathering procedure. I think this is the last. So, sorry. Medyo mahaba talaga. So, andyan pa naman kayo guys, diba? So, kahit di ko kayo naririnig, but still, sana nakikinig pa rin kayo. Okay? And for the last section, of the methodology is the statistical treatment of data that refers to the statistical technique that will be used in analyzing quantitative or qualitative data for proper interpretation and presentation. So researchers, of course, must specify the statistical treatment that will be used for interpreting the data, and of course, it is important for the researchers to state why they are necessary or bakit kailangan mo gamitin itong statistical treatment tool na to. So, the most common tool, next slide po. So, the most common statistical tools that are used by researchers are the descriptive statistics, inferential statistics, and now we also get to use statistical software or procedure. Okay? So under descriptive statistics, we have the two measure. We have two. The measure of central tendency and its subtypes are the mean, mode, and median. The measures of dispersion and its subtypes are the range, variance, and standard deviation. Next slide. Second statistical tool is the inferential statistics, and the most common method that are used here are the chi-square test, t-test, and f-test, or the ANOVA, or the analysis of variance. Last tool is the statistical software, wherein there is the SPSS, Microsoft Excel, and the SAS. Okay? But as far as I know, if I'm not mistaken, the SPSS is the most common statistical tool or used software ng mga researchers. So correct me if I'm wrong, okay? So I believe this was already discussed by the group 4 last week. So I guess I don't need to explain it again to you guys, okay? So let's, okay, tapusin na natin tong methodology. Example na agad, Kath. So here is the example of how statistical treatment of data should be written. So first, state what is the statistical treatment, and of course provide a brief description of it. Second is why it is necessary to be used. So tulad nito. So, statistical treatment of data. To interpret the gathered data, the researchers will use the following. Percentage. So, provide a brief description of it. So, it is a number or ratio expressed as a fraction of 100%. Second, bakit kailangan mo itong gamitin? So, it is the, okay, percentage is often denoted by using the percent sign, that you are seeing. So, second, bakit natin ito kailangan gamitin? It will be used to describe the profile of the subjects. Second, mean is also known as the average. It is obtained by dividing the sum of the observed values by the number of observations, or the n, because we are sample. It will also be used to describe the profile of the subjects. Third is the standard deviation, wherein it is a statistic that describes the amount of variation in a measured process characteristics. So it will also be used to describe the profile of these subjects. So last two. ANOVA is or the analysis of variance, or the F-test, is a statistical technique that is used to check if the means of two or more groups are significantly different from each other. So this will be used to determine the comparable groups for the experimental and control sections or groups. Lastly is the t-test. It is a type of inferential statistic used to determine if there is a significant difference between the means of two groups which may be related in certain features. So it will be used to determine if there is a significant difference between the performance, or yung minameasure natin is the post-test and final grades of the students in the experimental and control groups. So, I guess that's the end of the explanation for the chapter 3. So, in research proposal, we will be writing up to this chapter. So, we hope na naintindihan nyo yung discussion namin about this chapter, okay? So, let's proceed para sa ating chapter 4.
Hello, my name is Kabanyan Geraldine Bandaon, and I'll be discussing results and discussion. So yun, next slide. Yep, results and discussion part is where we interpret the findings of the research. Ito yung part na masasabi natin na patapos na tayo sa isang research. Konting push na lang, no ho? So the results section containing the description of the findings, while discussion section provides interpretation and the significance of findings. So, punta muna tayo sa result. The result section of an APA style paper summarizes the data that was collected, and statistical analysis that were performed. The goal of this section is to report the results without any type of subjective interpretation. Next up. Ito, unang-una, ang result part ng paper nyo ay nagpapatotoo sa mismong hypothesis nyo, no, in a straightforward manner. Next up. By the way, so hindi ko na, ipapaliwanag ko na lang yung nasa slide, hindi ko na siya babasahin kasi magiging redundant at saka alam kong medyo inaantok na kayo sa aming paliwanag. Next. Next, pre. Yeah, thank you. So, summarize results, meaning di na natin isasama yung raw data, which is sometimes called source data, atomic data, or primary data. So, ano nga bang raw data? Raw data is the thing that has not been processed for use. Tandaan na nagsasummarize ka ng result, hindi nagre-report. Full coverage of detailed findings lang, di na yung computation. Pwede tayong gumawa ng online archive para sa ating raw data. Next up. So yun, paano yan? Di naman tumama yung claims or hypothesis natin sa mismong data na nilabas ng research. For example is, ang theory mo ay nakakatubang bubble gum. Then nag-conduct ka ng ethical experiment. Then lumabas sa mga test na ang p-value ay greater than 0.05 or non-significant. Huwag mabahala mga dudes. Pwede pa rin natin siyang isama sa discussion part ng paper. Tandaan, mas mahalaga ang findings ng isang research kasi tested data na siya kaysa sa claims or prediction ng researcher mismo. Next up. Yeah. So this means that results na lang ang i-indicate sa mga statistical data, hindi ng computation. Total nakalagay na sa methodology ang mga process na iyon. Ayun. So include din natin kung hanggang saan ang sakop ng experiment and what extent. Katulad dun sa example sa taas, bubblegum show lang ang sakop ng experiment, not the whole comedy shows of GMA. Next up. So yeah, yan. So result part pertains to mostly numbers. So ano nga ba ang pinaka-understandable na form para mai-present siya ng mas bongga? Is gagamit tayo ng text, figures, tables, and much more. Note lang na huwag paulit-ulit ang paglabas ng data sa iba't ibang paraan. May confuse the readers, and also huwag maglagay ng table na walang subscript kung ano yung tinutukoy nito. Next up. Ayun. More tips for writing result section. So, papasadahan ko na lang ho kasi self-explanatory naman. Use the past tense, be concise and objective, use APA format, visit your library, get a second opinion. Ito yung, get a second opinion. Ito yung last resort ng researchers, no? Para di naman sila ganun ka-reliable kung may butas sa results ng study. At least di lang ikaw yung mababaliktad kasama yung tumulong sa'yo. Next up. Yes, punta tayo sa discussion. Discussion. It's not enough to use figures and tables in your result section to convince your readers about the importance of your findings. So, gagamit tayo ng mga arguments to support our findings. So, sa intro, di ba, nagpaliwanag tayo tungkol sa specific things sa study. Dito naman sa discussion, ay papalawakin natin yung significance ng findings. Sasagot sa mga main questions ng study. Next up. Yan. So, ano yung sinasabi ko sasagot sa mga main questions ng study? Napatunayan ba yung mga claims ng researcher? Kung hindi nakakuha ng statistically significant results, pag-ubusin ng page kaka-type kung ganito lang sana or kung ginawa ko lang to. Instead, give suggestions on how it will improve if conducted again and things like ano bang nangyari, ano bang meron, anong epekto nito sa society. bring your big boy theories kung yung findings mo ay kayang suportahan ng past learnings. Is the part where you openly discuss everything you all did. Remember, the heart of the discussion section is presenting an interpretation of your major findings. Next up. Okay, so example muna. Example muna ko ng discussion. Yung napili kong yung topic is yung in-assignment natin na matagal na panahon na. So, yung sa experiment ng soil at saka ng acidic soil at saka yung soil. Ito yung example na discussion. This experiment proved that acidic soil has a greater speed growth properties than regular soil. As shown in the graph, we can see a big growth gap between the two geraniums with a growth gap of nearly 25% in every week in favor of acidic soil. It's clearly a visible verdict of what's better. However, this experiment only have one type of plant as a subject, so this finding is limited to geranium plants only. Further experiments must be conducted in order to generalize the effect of acidic soil to different kind of plants. These findings is just a small step of gathering data on plant growths and interventions to make plant growth faster. With this, we can conclude that plant growers have more chance to produce products in a year with more experimental interventions at hand. This study gives a strong start on the study of how significant acidic soil to the plant nourishment. So yun. Final paragraph. Be sure to sum up your paper with a final concluding statement. Don't just trail off with an idea for a future study. And on a positive note, by reminding your reader why your study was important and why it added to the literature. Yun lang ho.
So, hello, I'm Robbie Miguel Nismal, BSP 310, and today I'll be presenting the next slide. Next slide, please. So, I'll be presenting the summary of the finding, conclusions, and recommendation. So, let's start. So, summary of the findings. Summary of the findings on the simplest of its terms is the summary of the findings dun sa questions or problems that were stated on Chapter 1, statement of the problem with the results coming from Chapter 4. So basically, a summary of findings tables presents the key information about the most important outcomes of the research. Next slide. So, ano dapat yung tandaan kapag mag-write ng summary? Number 1, clarification is the key. Since clarity is one of the important things when writing a summary, the summary of findings should include each of the specific questions that were posed dun sa problem statement and should always be written first, followed ng results kung paano ito i-resolve. Second, no deductions, inferences, or interpretation. There should be no deductions, inferences, or interpretations that are to be made dahil maulit lamang to dun sa conclusion part, which is pag-uusapan natin mamaya. Next, only the most essential findings. The data's highlights should be presented in the summary, especially those that will be used to draw conclusions. You don't need to include every paragraph you made, kaya nga summary of the findings eh. So, summarization lang dapat. Next is, it should be stated as accurate as possible. Oh, ayan. Be accurate sa ilalagay mo dun sa summary of the findings mo to not confuse the readers. Next is use past tense. To present the investigation's findings, use the past tense. Siyempre, tapos na kayo mag-conduct ng research, so tama lang na gawin yung past tense. Next slide. Yun, conclusions. Conclusion, the inferences taken from the study's finding are presented in the conclusion. Always remember na ang number of conclusions at ang number of findings ay dapat pareho. Walang labis, walang kulang. Because the conclusion is essentially the outcome of the findings na nahanap nyo. It should also leave a lasting impression to the readers and describe the study's key findings. So it makes it clear to the reader na na-address nyo yung issues dun sa gawa nyo. Next slide, please. Okay, when writing an effective conclusion, dalawang bagay dapat nasa isip. Connection with the statement of the problem, The conclusion of your study should clearly respond to the issues posed in the statement of the problem section. So, dapat may connect ang dalawang to. You can conclude na ang reason ba't ganun ang ugali ng bata is dahil sa parenting style. When you research problem, ask anong kinalaman ng sense of sight at smell sa panlasa ng middle-aged participants. So, next is don't assume things. Napaka-important na. Facts or actual outcomes from the inquiry or research project should be included in the conclusion. Your conclusions should never be drawn from the findings suggested or indirect implications. Wag na wag kayong magbe-base sa feeling po kasi namin ganito or majority po sa amin naisip ganyan. Kung ano yung na-discover nyo dun sa findings nyo, yun ang i-conclude nyo at ilagay nyo sa conclusions. Next slide, please. Ayun. Other guidelines in writing conclusions. So number 1, be concise. Your conclusion should be always conveyed in a clear and concise manner para madaling maintindihan ng readers. Second is precision and distinction. Conclusions should be precise and distinct. Like what I said earlier, need na connected ang conclusion mo sa findings. So need na distinct per findings. It's a bit weird kung sinamari mo yung conclusion mo to include all findings. Need mo i-address yun isa-isa. Next is additional problem. Conclusions, remember, should not offer new issues, ideas, or data that are unrelated to the research topic. Huwag ka na magdagdag ng wala namang kinalaman sa topic nyo since it may cause for your research to have a hole and baka needed na umulit na naman kayo. If you have issues or ideas, might as well put in the recommendation for future researchers to handle. Next is impression. The reader should get an interesting final impression after reading the conclusion. You want them to feel, wowed so that tumatak sa kanila yung research mo. Unresolved issues, avoid using terms like maybe or probably or other words na nagsasuggest na may unsolved concerns yung research nyo. Apologetic, yun. Conclusion should not contain any apologetic statements because of the unresolved issues dun sa research study nyo. Wag na wag kayong maglalagay ng we apologize for not finding enough data or we fail to see the correlation between, etc., etc. Next slide. So recommendations. Recommendations are based on the results of your research and indicate the specific measures or direction that can be taken. Recommendations usually play an important role dun sa research study. They are based on the findings of the study, so therefore they should not be based on your own personal beliefs. Rather, you should base them on the results of your research. They also should not be too broad as to lose the relevance to the specific topic of your research study. Next slide. Ayun, characteristics of a recommendation. First is yung relevance. Relevance to the studies, to be specific. Your recommendation should have a relevance to your study. You don't want the readers to get confused as to why you recommended to choose adult over kids when your topic is about how acidic soil affects plants. So next is logical reasoning. Always bear in mind that when recommending something, there must be a logical reason behind it. For example, for you to recommend na palitan yung age range, dapat ay may valid reason ka, like kasi mas angkop sa kanilang study, hindi yung wala lang, maiba lang na style. Always have a logical reasoning if you want to change. Next is feasibility and attainability. Make sure na convenient and madaling magagawa ang recommendation mo. You don't want to recommend something na mas lalong magpapahirap sa gustong mag-conduct din ng research nyo. The goal of the research is to help better understand things, not complicate them. Next is the purpose of recommendation. Recommendation for future research directions. Your recommendations will be the guide para sa gustong mag-replicate or gustong mag-in-depth palalo sa research nyo. You should never misguide them sa direction kung saan walang patutungan yung magiging research nila. Lead them sa direction kung saan lalong mas makakatulong sila sa pag-achieve ng goal ng research nyo. Next is recommendation to some problems that have been discovered in the research. If you found problems in your research, it's best na dito mo sa recommendation sabihin so that future researchers may have an idea kung paano pa nila mas matutulungan or maaayos yung research topic. Lastly, recommendations for improvement or change. The idea of recommendation is for that future researchers may have to improve your idea dun sa research mo. Possible rin na ma-change nila yung ibang aspect or variable and make your research a stepping stone to achieve a more concise and better results. So that's it. Thank you. Next slide.
Next up. So, hello, ako ulit. So, bibilisan ko na lang ho, no? Kasi ako na yung last reporter at alam kong natutulog na yung iba. So, merong 5 parts ang isang APA-styled reference at lahat sila ay may kanya-kanyang rules, no? Ho? So, isa-isahin natin. First is yung author rules. So, madali lang naman pag may isang author, apelyido then yung initials. Kung 2 or 3 authors naman, separated by commas. So, boom, paano kung lahat sila magkakapelyido? So, ganun pa rin ang procedure. Apelyido, then initials, pero lalagyan na natin ng square brackets na nakapaloob ang mga pangalan nila. Next, date rules. Nakaparenthesis pa rin. And yeah, date ng publishing. Bon, ano mas magandang ilagay? Full date or year lang? Based sa vlog na ginawa ni Jeff, yung Pratush Dates dates or magazines, newsletters, and newspapers should include the year and the exact date of the publication, according to the APA Publication Manual. This means that the month should be given for monthlies and the month and day for weeklies. If the periodical uses a season within a year, ilalagay natin yung year, tapos comma, tapos yung season na nakaparenthesis. So, to sum it up, that question, yes, mas magandang ilagay ang specific date, pero kung year, okay lang din naman. So, title rules. I-italic lang natin. So, minsan, pag walang author, yung title mismo ng material ang nilalagay sa reference. Naka-semicolon, and then yung year of publication. So, location of publisher, at saka yung publisher. So, sa location of publisher, pag outside sa US, city muna, then yung country. Pero pag sa US naman, city first, then 2-letter state code na naka-capital. So, paano naman yung sa publisher? So, madalas nasasama lang ang publisher sa mga books and hard copies of article. So, last part is yung URL or yung page. Sabihin na lang natin mas specific, mas maganda. I-indicate natin kung pang ilang paragraph and page yung idea na kinuha natin. Sa URL naman, wag URL kaagad. Lagyan naman natin ng retrieve from, then yung URL. So, paano naman? Ayun lang ho. Hindi na pala nasama sa ano. Thank you.
So, guess that's it. That's the end of our report. So, pasensya na guys and mom if medyo natagalan talaga. But then, I hope we are able to supplement you the knowledge on how it should be properly written. Of course, the guidelines and the tips na binigay ng ating mga reporters. So, if you are still grasping on it and still confused on some aspects, especially in the chapter 1 to 3, you can go and watch this recorded discussion again. Or pwede nang basahin. Ganon. So, again, we are the Group 5. Goodbye. God bless. Take care. And have a nice day. So, thank you, BSP 310 and Mom Army.
Stop ko na ba?
Yeah. So, thank you guys. Ano yata tayo? 1 hour 45 minutes.